The Enfield Mark I and Mark II revolvers are really a product of their time. There were other guns out there like the Colt and the Smith & Wesson, but the British decided to go their own way.
In the mid-19th century, British officers were required to privately purchase their sidearms, which meant that you saw a pretty wide variety of different arms being employed in the military, particularly in Indian service at the time. But there were standardized arms, and the early ones that we see in the cap and ball era are the Beaumont Adams, and then as the self-contained cartridge comes into vogue, you have the Adams conversion of the earlier Beaumont Adams, a conversion designed by John Adams, who pioneers this 450 cartridge conversion that sees 3 different variations. But eventually, the British government decides that it needs to produce a standardized arm. And so in 1879, they develop the Enfield Mark I, which is a .42 caliber revolver. It's a break-action revolver that is quickly supplanted by the Enfield Mark II, which is a .476 caliber revolver.
The .455 basically looked like the .455 Webley that we're familiar with today, using the same basic case dimensions. The .476 pistol used the same case and just had kind of a balloon-headed sort of bullet, which was hollow-based and had a clay plug in it, hearkening back to the old British 1851 mini system. Whether this had any efficacy, we don't know. The bottom line is the gun itself was issued to troops. It was issued to the Royal Navy and then issued to British troops. And as well, the gun was issued to the Northwest Mounted Police, who actually used this revolver longer and with greater efficiency than the British did.
The British Enfields, the Mark I and Mark II, are an interesting chapter in English handgun history. Here we have the English kind of arriving late to the game with self-contained metallic cartridges. And they've got Colt and Smith & Wesson as leaders in the field to look up to, take notice of what they've already developed in the 1870s, how to improve on that. And yet they don't really follow any of the lessons learned over on this side of the pond about self-contained metallic cartridges and firearms. The gun they come up with, the Enfield, is a top break, like a Smith & Wesson, but the cylinder doesn't come out of the gun, and to eject it, you kind of have to shake the receiver of the gun to get the empty casings to fall out. And like a Colt, to load the thing, you have to load it through a side gate. So it had all the worst attributes of both revolvers combined into one, which may be the reason why it was only around for about 5 or 6 years before it was replaced with, well, one of my personal favorites, the Webley in 1887.
The Enfield revolvers were innovative for the time in that they used what was called the Owen-Jones selective ejection system. And the whole idea of the Owen-Jones was when you broke open the gun, you could eject the spent cartridges and retain any unfired rounds in the cylinder so that you could keep those rounds in action and only reload the rounds that you had fired. It's an interesting idea, but in practice, this ended up being horrifically ineffective at times.
The Enfield revolver, if you compare that to what's being made by Smith & Wesson, and especially Colt, they're pretty sleek, pretty revolvers. The Enfield .476 has to be the clunkiest looking and handling. Trying to fire it, it just doesn't move easily like its contemporaries at that same time period. So it stays a curiosity amongst those who are interested in strange old British guns.
The gun had a fairly limited service life. It starts being made about 1880, and then the Webley Mark I is adopted in 1887. But that doesn't mean the career for this gun is over, because at that time, England had a huge empire. So these guns, as they were withdrawn from frontline service with British troops, would go on to serve in the colonies. Their most notable use, frankly even more famous than that of the British Army, was they were used by the Mounties, the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, later Royal Northwest Mounted Police. When you see those big flap holsters in the 1890s, up until after the turn of the 20th century, you know, odds are there's one of these big Enfields in there.
It was a robust enough gun. It wasn't prone to breakage. The Mark II was a definite improvement over the Mark I. The Mark I had a problem, you know, the cylinder kind of rotated on its own, and so the Mark II had it so that when the loading gate was closed, the cylinder actually locked. When you opened the loading gate, which is interesting for loading, it actually blocked the system from being cocked, so you could not pull the trigger and fire the gun at all by accident when the loading gate was open. In the Northwest Rebellion, matter of fact, at the Battle of Ducks Lake, an Enfield revolver fired the first shot in that particular conflict.